Judge Maria Williams sat at her bench, the morning sun casting a soft glow through the large windows of the courthouse she had come to call her second home. The courthouse was filled with the hum of people moving between rooms, the shuffle of shoes on the tile floor, the rustle of papers in the hands of attorneys, the low murmur of conversations as people prepared for their day. In court, Judge Williams had seen it all over the years. Her courtroom was where she commanded the space, where respect was expected, where the law reigned supreme. The case before her that day seemed routine on the surface. It was a traffic violation case with a white officer named Daniel Price testifying against a young man accused of reckless driving. Judge Williams had heard countless cases just like it, and her demeanor was steady as always. She glanced over the case file before her eyes flicking from one document to the next, making notes on the pages with practiced ease. She was focused, but the moment Officer Price stepped into the room, the energy shifted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform sharp, and pressed, his posture rigid, but there was something about the way he entered that made the air in the room feel heavy, as though he expected everyone to notice his presence and bow to it. From the moment he began speaking, his tone was condescending, his words clipped and dismissive. As he addressed Judge Williams, he made little effort to hide his sense of superiority, as if the courtroom were just another place where he could dominate with ease. He spoke over her when she asked questions and offered his opinions without waiting for her to give the floor. He interrupted her more than once, as if he had no need to respect her authority. Judge Williams held her ground, her eyes never leaving him, her voice calm and clear, though the simmering anger was there beneath the surface. She had faced this before countless times. It was something she had learned to navigate. Being a black woman in a field dominated by white men had its challenges, but she was never one to back down. She had earned her position, and she was determined to defend it. No matter who stood in her way, she was aware of the subtle undertones of disrespect that followed her wherever she went, and she knew how to handle them with grace. But this was different. There was something about Officer Price's demeanor that pushed her to the edge. She felt her chest tighten with every word he spoke, and the room grew still as the tension mounted. She could see the way the other people in the courtroom watched the exchange, their eyes flicking between the two of them, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, some uncomfortable, others unsure of how to react. Judge Williams remained silent, but inside her frustration was growing with each passing moment. She had no intention of letting this go. She would not allow anyone to undermine her or her authority, not in her own courtroom, not on her watch. The gavel came down with a sharp knock, signaling the end of the session for the day, but the unease lingered in the air as the people filed out of the room. Whispers began to rise behind closed doors, questions about what had just transpired and whether or not anyone would address it. Judge Williams knew this moment was far from over. She had to decide how to move forward and what kind of message she wanted to send about the respect due to everyone who walked through her doors. Judge Williams returned to her office after the session, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, her mind racing. She closed the door behind her with a soft click and leaned against it for a moment, closing her eyes as if to steady herself. It had been a long time since she had felt this way, so disrespected and so blatantly dismissed by someone she had once assumed would understand the gravity of his role. She had dealt with the subtle slights before, the microaggressions, the moments when people questioned her authority or assumed she wasn't capable, but this felt different. Officer Price had crossed a line, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was something deeper, something systemic. She walked to her desk and sat down, folding her hands in front of her, trying to center herself. But the anger from the courtroom still simmered beneath the surface. She knew this wasn't just about one officer. It was about the way people like her were often treated, the way her intelligence, her presence, her accomplishments were often overshadowed by biases and assumptions that others didn't have to face. She had worked so hard to get where she was, and yet moments like this threatened to make her question everything she had fought for. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up without looking at the caller ID and immediately heard the concerned voice of her clerk, Kelly. "Judge Williams, are you okay?" We were all watching in there. We could feel the tension. It was hard to watch. Kelly's voice was full of empathy, but there was an underlying fear in it too. People didn't always know how to react when someone in authority was challenged, especially when that someone was a black woman. Kelly had witnessed many of these subtle moments of disrespect toward Judge Williams over the years, but this felt different. Kelly had seen the way Officer Price had acted, how it wasn't just a slip of the tongue or an innocent misunderstanding, it was intentional. "I'm fine, Kelly, just a little." Frustrated, Judge Williams replied, her voice softer than she intended. She didn't want to appear vulnerable. She didn't want anyone to think she couldn't handle herself. "He crossed the line today, and I need to figure out what to do about it." There was a long pause on the other end before Kelly spoke again. "Do you want me to do anything? Do you need me to step in?" Judge Williams shook her head, even though Kelly couldn't see her. "No, this is something I have to handle on my own, but thank you." She hung up the phone and sat in the stillness of her office for a moment longer. She needed to think. She needed to decide how to approach this situation carefully, because her next steps would send a message, not just to Officer Price, but to everyone in the courthouse and perhaps beyond. She knew what was at stake. It wasn't just her pride or her authority as a judge. It was something bigger. It was about setting a precedent that disrespect wouldn't be tolerated. It was about standing up for herself and the people who came before her every day, the people who trusted her to be fair, and just who trusted that she would do her job with integrity. She couldn't allow this moment to go unaddressed, because if she did, it would only reinforce the idea that certain people were above reproach, that their behavior was somehow acceptable when it was anything but. The thought of confronting Officer Price made her stomach turn, but she knew she couldn't let it go this time, not when it mattered so much. She would call him into her chambers. Tomorrow, she would face him head-on and tell him exactly why his actions were unacceptable and what needed to change. She took a deep breath, standing up from her desk and looking out the window as the afternoon light began to fade. The courthouse was quiet now, but she knew tomorrow would bring a different kind of confrontation, one that would test her in ways she hadn't expected. The next morning arrived with an uneasy tension hanging in the air. Judge Williams knew that the time had come to confront Officer Price, and though she had prepared herself mentally, she couldn't shake the knot of anticipation that twisted in her stomach. She had spent hours the night before thinking about what to say and how to say it, crafting the perfect words that would express both her authority and her disappointment. This wasn't just about a single outburst in her courtroom. It was about something much deeper, something that had festered for far too long. She wasn't just going to let this moment pass. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., Judge Williams stood from her desk and made her way to her chambers. She moved with a steady, purposeful gait, her heels clicking against the marble floors. When she reached the door to her chambers, she paused, taking a deep breath before she knocked lightly. There was a brief pause before Officer Price's voice called out, "Come in." He stood at attention when she entered, his face unreadable. Officer Price, tall and imposing in his uniform, had no idea what was about to happen. Judge Williams took a moment to survey him, looking him in the eyes as she shut the door behind her. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with an unspoken challenge. She was ready. This was her courtroom, and he would understand that today. "Sit down, officer," Judge Williams said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that immediately commanded respect. Officer Price hesitated for a moment, then complied, sitting down across from her at the small table. The silence between them stretched, neither of them speaking, both aware of the gravity of the situation. Judge Williams studied him carefully, taking in the way his hands rested on the table, his posture stiff and rigid, as though bracing for something. She couldn't help but notice how different he looked now, without the protection of the courtroom. This was her space, and it would be her rules that would define this conversation. Finally, she broke the silence. "Yesterday," she began, her tone deliberate, "you disrespected me in my courtroom, in front of everyone." Officer Price opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "Don't interrupt," she said. "I will not tolerate it." Her voice held a sharpness that made him pause. "I understand that you are an officer of the law, and I respect your position, but I will not allow anyone to undermine my authority, especially not in my own courtroom." She leaned forward slightly, fixing him with a steady gaze. "When you speak over me, when you disregard my instructions, you do more than disrespect me. You disrespect the very institution we both serve. You make a mockery of the system we've both sworn to uphold." Officer Price's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists, but he said nothing. He had expected a reprimand, but not like this. The calmness in her voice was unnerving, and the weight of her words settled heavily on him. He hadn't realized how much his actions had affected her, or how deeply they resonated with the broader system of power they both navigated every day. Judge Williams continued, her voice softening but still firm. You may not see it now, but there are people who walk into that courtroom every day who already feel like they have to prove themselves. People who don't have the luxury of your privilege. When you dismiss me in front of them, when you challenge my authority in such an overt way, you're sending a message about who belongs here and who doesn't. The silence in the room grew thicker, and for the first time, Officer Price felt the weight of her words. He knew she was right. He had been acting as if his presence in the courtroom was unquestionable, as if his role as an officer gave him a right to speak down to others. It wasn't something he had ever considered deeply, but now, hearing it from her, it felt as though a light had been shone on something he'd been blind to. I'm sorry, he finally muttered, his voice lower than usual. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I wasn't thinking. Judge Williams nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. You didn't just disrespect me, Officer Price. You disrespected every person who walks into that courtroom hoping to be treated fairly. And you need to understand that the respect we show one another is not just about civility. It's about upholding the integrity of the system we're both a part of. He sat in silence, his mind racing as he absorbed the weight of her words. He had thought his actions were justified. He had always been in control, always in a position of power. But now, in the quiet of this room, he was beginning to see the cracks in his own perception. This wasn't just about power. It was about respect, accountability, and humility. As the silence stretched between them, Officer Price remained seated, his hands resting in his lap, his posture less rigid than before, but still tense. Judge Williams observed him carefully, her gaze unwavering. She had said her piece, and now she would allow him the space to respond. But it was clear that this was not a conversation that could be easily dismissed. The weight of her words had landed, and she knew he could feel it. Finally, Officer Price shifted in his seat, exhaling deeply as if letting go of a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I didn't think it was a big deal, he said, his voice quieter than before. He looked down at the table, the words coming more slowly now, as though he were carefully considering them. I've been doing this job for so long. I've been in high-pressure situations, you know. I've seen things most people couldn't imagine. And I guess sometimes I get used to being in control, to having people listen to me without question. Judge Williams didn't interrupt, but she could sense the vulnerability in his voice, something raw and unguarded that hadn't been there before. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a glimpse into the mindset that had led to the behavior she had confronted. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening just slightly, though her resolve remained firm. I understand, she said, her tone gentle, but what you need to understand, officer, is that this isn't about control. Not here, not in my courtroom. He looked up at her then, his eyes uncertain, but searching for some kind of clarity. This isn't about you trying to win or assert authority over me. This is about respect for the system we both represent. You're not just an officer. You're a part of the justice system. But so am I. And when we don't show each other that basic respect, we erode the very foundation of that system. The people who walk into that courtroom, they come in with expectations. They come in expecting fairness, equality, and a fair hearing. If you're undermining my authority, then you're undermining the very thing that guarantees their rights. Officer Price's jaw tightened as he absorbed her words, the weight of them sinking in. For a moment, the room was quiet again. The truth had been laid bare between them. Judge Williams had not only addressed his behavior, but had also made him confront something he hadn't fully considered before, the impact of his actions beyond the immediate situation. She continued, her voice calm but firm, you can't expect people to respect the system if they see those who uphold it acting in a way that is disrespectful, dismissive, or arrogant. The law is not about who has the louder voice or the bigger presence. It's about fairness, about justice, about ensuring that no one is above the law. Not you, not me, not anyone. Officer Price shifted in his seat, his eyes now focused on her, a look of realization dawning on his face. He had never considered things from this perspective before. He had always viewed his role as an officer as one of unquestionable authority, not realizing how that attitude could clash with the very system of checks and balances that was meant to keep everyone accountable. He had been wrong. His actions in the courtroom had not been a matter of defending his position. They had been a matter of pride and ego. "I didn't see it like that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think about how my actions would affect the people in your courtroom, or you." Judge Williams nodded slowly. "That's the problem. And it's something that many of us in positions of power have to constantly remind ourselves. It's not about us. It's about the people we serve." She paused for a moment, watching him carefully. Officer Price was listening now, truly listening. She had hoped this would be a moment of growth for him, and it seemed like it was beginning to take hold. "I'm not telling you this to shame you, Officer Price," Judge Williams said, her voice softening. "But I'm telling you this because you're better than the way you acted yesterday. You're better than letting your pride get in the way of the work you do. And I need you to do better, not just for me, but for everyone who walks into that courtroom. The system can't work if we let our egos get in the way." For the first time since the confrontation began, Officer Price nodded, a deep, almost imperceptible nod. It was as if a shift had occurred within him, a quiet realization that he could do better, that he needed to do better. "I will," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'll do better. I promise." Judge Williams allowed herself a small nod of acknowledgement. "I believe you. But don't just say it. Show it." With that, the tension in the room eased slightly, though there was still a sense of gravity in the air. They both knew this conversation was far from over, but for the first time, there was a genuine understanding between them. The confrontation had not just been about her standing her ground. It had been about holding him accountable and offering him the chance to rise above his own flaws. And for the first time in a long while, Officer Price felt a sense of humility, one that he hadn't expected to find in this room. The following day, the atmosphere in the courthouse felt different. It wasn't just the usual hum of activity or the bustling movement of lawyers and clerks. There was a quiet sense of anticipation, as though everyone could feel the shift in the air after the confrontation between Judge Williams and Officer Price. Word had spread among the courthouse staff, whispers of the intense conversation that had taken place behind closed doors. Some people wondered what had been said, while others simply felt the weight of what had occurred, a quiet recognition that something had changed. Judge Williams was aware of the attention. She didn't need to hear the gossip to know it was there. It was one of the prices of being in a position of authority. People were always watching, always trying to gauge how she would respond to the challenges that came her way. But today, she didn't care about the whispers. Today, she was focused on the future, the work ahead, and the changes she hoped to see, not just in Officer Price, but in the system as a whole. When the court session began, Officer Price was the first to arrive. There was something different about him now. His posture, usually rigid and somewhat defensive, was more relaxed, more open. His gaze was steady, his interactions with the attorneys and other officers far more respectful than before. It was subtle, but Judge Williams noticed the difference immediately. His apology the day before hadn't been just words. It seemed to have sunk in deeper than she had expected. He was trying to change, and that in itself meant something. As the day wore on, Judge Williams couldn't help but notice the ripple effect his actions had begun to have. The staff who had once quietly observed his dismissive attitude were now watching with new eyes. There was a shift in the dynamic, a subtle change in the way people carried themselves in the courtroom. It was as though they were all waiting to see if Officer Price's newfound respect would hold. But it wasn't just his actions that had started to change. The atmosphere in the courtroom, in general, had shifted as well. Judge Williams made it a point to address everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of their status or role in the case. She spoke with calm authority, but her words carried the weight of someone who had earned her place in the room, who had fought to be there and was determined to maintain her dignity. She knew that respect was a two-way street, and that it needed to be established and upheld on both sides. As she addressed the lawyers, the defendants, and even the witnesses, she made sure her tone was firm but fair, reminding everyone in the room of the integrity of the system they were a part of. Throughout the day, Judge Williams found herself reflecting on the previous day's conversation with Officer Price. She had been firm with him, but she had also given him a chance to redeem himself. She knew that accountability wasn't just about reprimanding someone, it was about offering them a path to do better, to make amends and change their behavior. And she had done that in a way that allowed him to recognize his mistakes and grow from them. It was a lesson she had learned early in her career, the importance of giving people the opportunity to change, even when it was hard to do so. It wasn't about letting people off the hook, it was about empowering them to do better. As the day drew to a close, Judge Williams felt a sense of quiet pride. The case she had been focused on was now complete, and Officer Price's role in it had taken a turn for the better. The courtroom had run smoothly, and there had been no more signs of disrespect or tension. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. She knew that this one moment wouldn't change everything, but she was hopeful that it would be the first step in a much larger transformation. She gathered her things, preparing to leave for the evening, when she caught a glimpse of Officer Price in the hallway. He was talking to a colleague, but when he saw her, he nodded respectfully and said, "Judge Williams, thank you for your patience. I'm working on it, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." She nodded back, offering him a small but genuine smile. "I believe you, officer. Just keep doing better." As she watched him walk away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Change was slow, but it was possible. And in moments like this, when people were willing to recognize their flaws and work toward improvement, it felt like progress was within reach. She didn't need grand gestures or instant results. She just needed people to understand the power of respect and the impact it could have on everything they did. Weeks passed, and the courthouse slowly settled back into its rhythm. The change that had started with a single confrontation between Judge Williams and Officer Price was subtle but undeniable. The officers in the courtroom were more respectful, the lawyers more focused, and there was an air of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. It wasn't perfect, not everything had been fixed, but the shift was tangible. People were more mindful of how they treated one another. Even the small gestures, the tone of voice, the way they addressed each other, had all begun to change. It wasn't just about Officer Price anymore. It was about the environment that Judge Williams had fought to create and the example she had set. But while things were improving on the surface, Judge Williams knew that there was still more work to be done. One conversation, one confrontation, wasn't going to erase years of ingrained attitudes or fix the systemic issues that existed beneath the surface. There was still deep-seated bias in the way people viewed her, the way they viewed each other, and the way the entire system functioned. The courthouse may have felt calmer, but Judge Williams knew that calmness didn't necessarily equate to progress. One afternoon, as Judge Williams sat in her office reviewing a complex case, there was a knock at the door. She looked up to see Officer Price standing in the doorway, his uniform crisp, his posture still more open and relaxed than it had been months ago. "Judge Williams," he said, his voice steady. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, officer." "Come in," she replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. There was no tension between them now, just a quiet understanding. He sat down across from her, his eyes focused but serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about that day," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Not just about my behavior, but about everything, the system. I've realized it's not just about me or about how I act. It's about the bigger picture. And I've seen it. I've seen how people in this courthouse treat each other based on assumptions, based on their roles, based on history. It's not right." Judge Williams regarded him carefully. This was not the same man who had walked into her chambers months ago. The shift in him was becoming more evident every day. "I've noticed it too," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The system is built on patterns. Some of those patterns are visible, but a lot of them are so deeply embedded in the way we think that it's hard for people to even recognize them. It's not just about individual behavior. It's about how the entire system operates." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. I didn't realize how much I was part of that system, how much I contributed to it without even thinking. I never saw how my actions fit into the bigger picture of injustice. Judge Williams smiled slightly, though there was no amusement in it. Most people don't. That's the problem. People can go through their whole lives not realizing the impact they have. The system makes it easy to do so. There are so many layers of bias, so many ways that people's actions can be excused or justified. There was a long silence between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, the kind of quiet that came from both sides processing the conversation. So what do we do about it? Officer Price asked after a moment. I've been thinking about it, and I don't know where to start. I can change the way I act, but I feel like that's just the surface. There's more to it than that. Judge Williams leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady as she considered his words. Change has to come from every corner of the system. It's not enough to just alter one person's behavior. We need to look at the bigger picture, the policies, the attitudes, the assumptions that influence every decision we make. But it starts with people like you and me. It starts with recognizing the problem and being willing to speak out when we see it. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. The first step is always awareness. Once you understand the problem, you can begin to address it, piece by piece. But it's not easy. It's uncomfortable. It's not about doing the right thing in the moment. It's about questioning everything you thought you knew. Officer Price sat quietly, absorbing her words. He could feel the magnitude of what she was saying. It wasn't just about him changing. It was about challenging the very foundation of the system that had allowed for this kind of behavior to go unchecked for so long. I'm willing to try, he said, his voice stronger now. I want to make it right. I want to be part of the solution. Judge Williams nodded. That's a good start, officer. But don't think that your actions alone will solve it. Change happens when people come together to make their voices heard. When they stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Even when it costs them. He looked at her, his face serious. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. Judge Williams didn't smile, but there was a warmth in her gaze. We'll do it together, one step at a time. Weeks passed, and the seeds of change that Judge Williams and Officer Price had planted continued to grow, but the road ahead was not without obstacles. While there were signs of improvement in the courthouse, small moments of respect exchanged between officers, attorneys, and judges, there was an underlying tension that neither could ignore. Despite the changes, the system itself was still resistant to real transformation. The courthouse, like many other institutions, was a machine that had been built on years of tradition, some of it good, but much of it flawed. It wasn't enough for individuals to change. The whole system needed to shift, and that would take time. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging case, Judge Williams sat alone in her chambers, her hands resting on the papers before her. The weight of the day was heavy on her shoulders. She had witnessed firsthand the deep divides that still existed in the justice system, the way certain voices were always louder than others, the way some defendants were treated with suspicion before they had even spoken. She had spent her career fighting to be seen as equal in a space that had never been designed for someone like her, and she knew that the fight wasn't over. It was never over. As Judge Williams lost herself in thought, a knock came at the door. She looked up to see Officer Price standing there, his face more serious than usual. He had been making a point to check in with her more often lately, seeking her guidance, asking her about cases, about the nuances of the system that he had never truly seen before. It was clear that the conversation they had shared weeks ago had sparked something inside him. Something that, in many ways, had been buried for years. Judge Williams, he began, stepping into the room. Do you have a moment to talk? She gestured for him to sit, her gaze softening. Of course, officer. What's on your mind? Officer Price hesitated, a look of frustration flickering across his face. I've been noticing some things in the courthouse lately. Things that make me question whether the changes we're trying to make are really enough. Judge Williams leaned forward, listening intently. Go on. Yesterday, I witnessed something. A defendant, a young man, was brought into the courtroom. He hadn't even been given a chance to speak, but the way the prosecutor treated him, the assumptions they made about him from the moment he walked in, it was like they had already decided what kind of person he was before he had a chance to prove otherwise. Judge Williams nodded, already knowing where he was going. I've seen it, and I've seen it happen far too often. It's not just about how we treat people in the courtroom. It's about how we see them before they even step foot in the room. The assumptions we make based on their race, their background, their economic status. These biases, whether conscious or not, inform every decision we make. I know, Officer Price said quietly. It's been hard for me to see it, to realize that I've been a part of that system without even knowing it. But I'm starting to see how deep it goes, how much it shapes everything. Judge Williams took a deep breath, her gaze thoughtful. It's a difficult thing to recognize, officer. We're not always aware of the biases we carry with us, but that doesn't make them any less real. Change, real change, starts with acknowledging those biases and then confronting them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges everything we thought we knew about ourselves. I've been trying, he said, his voice filled with determination. But sometimes it feels like it's too much, like the system is too big for any of us to change. Judge Williams met his eyes, her expression firm but compassionate. The system is big, yes, and it's entrenched, but that doesn't mean change is impossible. Every moment, every conversation, every action we take to challenge the status quo, those things matter. We may not see the results immediately, but it's the only way forward. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of their words lingering in the room. Officer Price had come to realize that this was no longer just about improving his own actions. It was about taking a stand, even when it felt like one voice couldn't possibly make a difference. But Judge Williams had lived through enough to know that small actions could lead to big changes. The road was long, and it was often uphill, but it was the only road worth traveling. I'll keep fighting, Officer Price said finally, his voice steady. Even if it feels like a long road, I'll keep trying to do better. I know it's not enough to change my actions. It's about changing the way we all think, the way we all act. And I don't stop. Judge Williams smiled slightly, a sense of pride filling her chest. That's all any of us can do. Keep fighting one step at a time. And when the moment comes for you to stand up, to speak out against the system, you do it. And I'll be right behind you. As Officer Price left her chambers, Judge Williams sat back in her chair, her mind still turning over the conversation. She knew that the work they were doing wasn't easy, that the challenges ahead would be great. But she also knew that real change would come from people like Officer Price, the ones willing to acknowledge their own shortcomings and push forward, even when it felt impossible. The road ahead was long, but it was a road they were both prepared to travel together. The weeks that followed were a turning point, not just for Officer Price, but for the entire courthouse. The ripple effects of the conversations Judge Williams had started were slowly taking root in the hearts and minds of others. It wasn't immediate. Change never was, but it was tangible. The shifts in attitude were no longer isolated to just the judge and one officer. They had become the foundation for a broader dialogue, one that was long overdue. Judge Williams felt it most keenly in the moments between sessions. She would walk the hallways and see the subtle ways in which people interacted. The slight nods between officers and attorneys, the careful way jurors listened to each other, the respect with which the defendants were now treated. It was the kind of shift that could not be measured by statistics or case outcomes, but it was a shift nonetheless. Officer Price had continued his journey towards self-awareness. His growth was slow, but there was no denying it. He no longer walked into the courtroom with the arrogance that had once marked his every step. He now took a moment to observe, to listen, to truly understand the individuals in front of him before making judgments. More importantly, he had started to speak up when he saw the biases and assumptions that continued to permeate the system. He was no longer passive in his role. He was actively challenging the structures that had made him complicit in injustice. One day, as the courtroom emptied after a particularly difficult case, Officer Price approached Judge Williams. She had been sitting at her desk, reviewing case notes, when she heard his footsteps. "Judge," he began, his voice carrying a seriousness that had become all too familiar. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about the system, about myself, and about how much further we still have to go." Judge Williams looked up at him, her expression calm but attentive. "Go on, officer." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think we're making progress, but it's not enough. I see the change in myself, in the way I approach things, but I don't think I can just leave it at that. There's too much at stake for me to ignore it now. I want to do more." Her gaze softened slightly, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "What do you mean by more?" "I mean, I don't think it's enough to change the way I think or the way I act. I need to be part of the conversations. I need to speak out when I see injustice happening in front of me. It's not just about doing my job well. It's about ensuring that the system does its job right. I need to be a part of that. I want to be a voice for those who don't have one." Judge Williams regarded him for a long moment, letting his words settle between them. This was the growth she had hoped for, the kind of evolution that came from real, meaningful change. She had seen it in many others before, but never in someone so determined to not just change themselves, but to impact the system as a whole.